I've never forgotten the sound of the text message that changed the way I saw my son forever. It was a Saturday night, one of those nights when the sun slowly sets behind the rooftops and the air still smells of freshly baked bread. I had prepared a small dessert to pick me up, just the way he liked it to celebrate his promotion. He had worked so hard, day and night, and I was so proud. In my head, I imagined that he would call me, that he would say, "Mom, come with us tonight. We all celebrate together." I had even put on my best dress, the light blue one with the little mother-of-pearl buttons. It was a small thing, but I wanted to be ready, like when your children are little and you get ready with excitement for their school play. Only that night there was no play and no invitations. At 7:30, the house was quiet. Every now and then I would look at my phone, check that it wasn't on silent. Then I would put it on the table and pretend not to expect anything, but deep down, I knew that I was waiting. Sometimes a mother's love is like a candle that burns slowly even when there's no more oxygen. Then, at 8 o'clock sharp, a message arrived. It wasn't from my son. It was from my daughter-in-law, Julia. On the screen, I read, "Mom, remember to finish the leftovers in the fridge." There was no period, no heart, no thank you. Just that phrase, leftovers. I stared at those words as if I didn't understand them. Leftovers, as if I were part of the fridge, not the family. I sat down at the table, the pick-me-up still untouched in front of me. I'd even baked a small dish of pasta, anticipating their visit after dinner. The goal was just a quick hello, a shared slice of cake, nothing fancy. But time passed and I understood. I understood that evening they were celebrating elsewhere, without me. I didn't cry right away. At first it was as if something inside me had simply gone out, like a light that decides on its own that it doesn't want to shine anymore. I sent a simple, almost automatic reply. Okay, just 2 words. Okay, but it wasn't true. It wasn't okay at all. I just didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of hearing my disappointment. I got up, opened the refrigerator, and really did see those leftovers. A piece of lasagna, half a bottle of water, 2 slices of chicken, yoni. I looked at them like you look at something that didn't belong to you anymore. I closed the door, and the kitchen fell silent again. It was at that moment that I decided not to stay where I wasn't wanted anymore. I sat down again, this time calmly. I looked around the house at the family photos, the Christmas presents bought just for the sake of it, the greeting cards written with polite but empty words. Everything suddenly felt cold, distant. I was reminded of when, a few years previous, I'd lent my son the money for the deposit on the same house. He had said that it was an investment for the family, that we would always have a place in there together. I had believed that word, together, but that evening, together, the table was set elsewhere with raised glasses and laughter while I counted the seconds to the ticking of the clock. I resisted the impulse to become angry, to shout, or to call anyone to ask why. Sometimes pain just doesn't require an outburst. It quietly creeps in and settles beside you, much like an old and unwelcome companion. I stayed like that for hours, with the television on a program I wasn't watching, while the pick-me-up slowly melted and the cream began to separate. It was as if even that dessert knew it didn't make sense anymore. When the clock struck 11:30, I understood. I understood that they wouldn't be back soon. I felt a silence so deep inside me that it almost made noise. It was then that the decision was formed without words. I got up and went to the room. I opened the wardrobe and took out my smallest suitcase, the one I had used the last time I had gone to the beach with my husband many years before. I put it on the bed and opened it. I still didn't know where I would go, but I knew I had to go. The clothes I folded became a silent testament to each thought, a quiet act of farewell. Every sweater I put on was a wound that closed on its own. I also picked up the family photo, the one I had always kept on the sideboard. My son Julia, my 2 grandchildren, me behind, with a smile that now seemed forced. I looked at it for a long time and then turned it, leaving it with its face turned to the wall. I left a note on the kitchen table. It wasn't a letter or a reprimand, just 3 words. "You go ahead," unsigned. It wasn't necessary. Iwa idupima. Then I took the keys, left them next to the note, and closed the door softly behind me. The sound of the latch was like a long, liberating breath. Outside the air was cold, but clean. Walking towards the bus stop, my suitcase clattered loudly as it rolled across the asphalt surface. I still didn't know where I would sleep that night, but I knew that for the first time, in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone. Every step was a detachment, a further centimeter of freedom. When the bus arrived, I sat down in the back, next to the window. The city lights flickered by like fading memories. I looked at my phone one more time. Neither phone calls nor texts, and for the first time, it didn't upset me. It was just confirmation of what I already knew. When they stop inviting you, it's because they've already decided that you don't belong anymore. But what they didn't know was that night, while they were toasting to a future without me, I was already writing my future without them. When the bus dropped me off in front of the station, the cold bit my fingers. I didn't remember to bring the gloves. I had left them there on the table, beside the ticket and the keys. It was only right that way. Everything I'd left behind belonged to that home, to that version of me that was still waiting for a place at the table. I, on the other hand, had stopped waiting. I walked into the station waiting room, sat down on a metal bench and rested my suitcase between my legs. I could still hear the sound of the clock in the kitchen. That ticking, that marked the hours of my uselessness. And yet, in the midst of that cold, something strange went through me. A light, almost imperceptible sensation. Freedom. Perhaps it was just tiredness, but for a moment I breathed without weight. I thought back to the refrigerator, to that cold white light I had seen just before leaving. The leftovers were still there, arranged like a coded message. A piece of lasagna, 2 slices of chicken, a glass of leftover wine. Everything seemed to be waiting for someone who would never return. There was something tragically symbolic about that full refrigerator and that empty house. I was constantly concerned about my son. I worried he wasn't eating enough, that his workload was excessive, that he was neglecting his own needs. And instead, it was I who was overlooked, set aside, like leftover food, forgotten and unwanted. Mothers spend their lives constantly filling plates, tirelessly tidying up, and preparing space for everyone else. But no one ever makes a place for them. I stayed at the station until late. I watched people pass by, families, couples, young people with big backpacks and eyes full of the future. I, on the other hand, had only a small suitcase and a past weighing on my shoulders. When the loudspeaker announced the last train to the coast, I didn't think twice. I hadn't even a clue where it would lead me precisely, but I felt the need to get away. I bought a ticket with the last few notes in my wallet and got on board. The carriage was almost empty. I sat by the window and watched the darkness pass outside. In there, between the noise of the train and my breathing, I began to feel the distance growing, not just physical, but emotional too. As the train sped by, I thought about all the little moments that had brought me here. My son's short answers, Julia, forced smiles, the lunches where they talked about everything except me. Every time I tried to tell them something, it always ended with a yes, Mom, but now is not the time. There was never a time. And I, like many mothers, had learned to make myself small, not to disturb them. I thought that all it took was to remain silent to be loved. But I was wrong. Silence sometimes doesn't save. It erases. I arrived in a small seaside town at dawn. The sky was a soft ridi, and the streets were still damp from the rain. I took a cheap room in a guest house near the harbor. The owner, a woman with white hair tied back in a bun, didn't ask any questions. She gave me the key and a kind smile. Inside the room, everything was simple. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out to sea. I put down my suitcase, took off my coat, and stood looking out. The water was calm, still as if it knew I needed peace and quiet. I sat on the bed, and without wanting to, I began to think about what was happening at that moment in the house I had left. I imagined them coming back from the restaurant with their cheeks red from the wine and their laughter still warm. Maybe Julia would have said something like, "I hope Mom wasn't offended," and my son, would have replied absent-mindedly. But no, he's used to it. Those words, "she's used to it," continued to echo in my mind. It was true. I was used to everything. To be invisible, to being useful but never needed, to cooking without being invited to eat. But that evening, while they were toasting, I had decided that I would no longer be used to it. I had chosen to be free. The days passed. Every morning, I went down to have breakfast at the small bar in the guest house. The scent of coffee and the sea mingled, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to serve anyone. No one asked me if there was any milk or, "Did you see where I put the keys?" No one spoke to me with that polite tone that hides impatience. It was a different, new silence, and in the midst of that silence, I began to find my voice again, a low, calm voice, but firm. A certain morning, a desire to write woke me. I grabbed a sheet of paper and started jotting down words. Not a formal letter, but something more like a personal diary. In my letter, I described the refrigerator, Julia's message, and the oddly unsettling sensation of being a guest in the house I'd contributed to purchasing. I wrote that mothers don't ask for recognition. They only ask for presence. I continued writing for hours, until the son entered the room, and I realized that I hadn't thought about them for a whole moment. It was a silent victory, but a real one. And yet, I knew that that calm was only the beginning. There was something inside me that was moving, a new awareness, see. I realized that I hadn't really given up everything. I still had a bond, a thread that kept them united to me. Not out of love, that was now wounded, but out of justice. There was something that they didn't remember, or perhaps had never known. The house they lived in didn't belong to them alone, it was mine, too. Half of that house, every brick, every paid bill bore my name, and as I looked out to sea, I understood that sooner or later I would have to do something, not out of revenge, but out of respect for myself. That evening, as I was having dinner with a bowl of hot soup, I felt a weight lift. I was afraid, yes, but also a strange strength. I was no longer the woman who used to wait by the telephone desperately hoping for a call. I was now the woman who had made a conscious decision to leave, and that decision possessed a dignity that no message of disdain could ever hope to extinguish. I fell asleep late, listening to the sound of the sea against the stones of the pier. I thought once more about the refrigerator. Perhaps Julia had opened it that night and seen the emptiness. Perhaps for the first time she had realized that my silence was not surrender, but decision. What they didn't know was that real changes always begin like this, with a door quietly closed, a note left on the table, and a woman who finally understands that she should no longer stay where she is not loved. On the third day in the small guest house, when the sun was still timidly filtering through the cream-colored curtains, I opened the suitcase I had brought with me, and I realized that I hadn't really looked inside since I had arrived. I hastily shut it away. In my old room, my heart beating rapidly and my mind struggling to stay focused and rational. Inside there were just a few things. 3 sweaters, a book with the cover folded, a perfume that was almost finished, and a red envelope that I had put in at the last moment without thinking too much about it. I pulled it out. It was the envelope in which I kept important documents, the ones I had always kept carefully and that no one had ever asked to see. It was like a silent secret, forgotten in the drawers of an entire life. He opened it slowly. Inside were copies of the bank transfers that I had made years before, when my son and Julia had decided to buy the house. I still remembered the day they had told me that the bank would not grant the full mortgage. He said it's just temporary help, using that sweetly persuasive tone of voice he often reserved for when he needed something. I didn't hesitate. It's for the family, I thought. For his future. I had signed. I had made the transfer. I had even given up a small investment that would have guaranteed me a peaceful old age. But at the time I didn't care, because I believed that peace of mind meant having my son by my side. I didn't know that one day that same signature would become my freedom. Sitting on the bed, I looked at those sheets and felt the weight of everything I had silently accepted. I wondered how many times they had counted on my silence, on my habit of never saying no. How many times I had pretended not to see, not to hear, just to avoid creating tension. But that morning, in that hotel room where no one knew my name, I decided it was over. I didn't want to be the woman who forgives everything anymore. I wanted to be the woman who starts over. I made a list. I didn't know exactly what for yet, but I needed to put things in order inside and outside of me. I wrote on a sheet of paper: law firm, bank, telephone, documents, mail. I was aware that eventually my son would come to notice my absence, and I anticipated that his initial response, it wouldn't have been a cause for concern, but rather an inconvenience, because my silence was convenient for everyone. As long as I was there, I was convenient. As long as I was silent, I was useful. But now that I was gone, my silence would have made noise. In the afternoon, I went out to look for a phone booth. Yes, a phone booth. I had left my cell phone on the nightstand at home on purpose. I didn't want to be tracked down, not yet. I wanted them to understand what my absence really meant. I put a coin in the booth and called the office of the notary who had assisted me years earlier in the sale. "Mrs. Ferry," I said in a calm voice, "I would like to know if it is possible to review the deed to my son's house. There are some changes I would like to discuss." The secretary recognized my voice and said that the notary would call me back. "Okay," I replied. "Can you contact me here?" At the San Marco guest house, room 4. I suddenly felt alive. It was as if every word I said was a step that brought me back to myself. I went back to my room and opened my suitcase again. I picked up the book and began to read, but the words slipped away. I kept thinking about the house, my grandchildren, Julia. I wondered if when they came back that night they would have understood immediately that I had left forever. I imagined Julia in front of the refrigerator, the note on the table, the lights on, and my room empty etc. I knew her well. She would have reacted coldly, perhaps, pretending not to care, but deep down, behind her confidence, there had always been fear. Fear that one day her facade of perfection would crack. That evening, the owner of the guest house knocked on the door to ask if I wanted some hot soup. I said yes. When she brought it to me, she looked at me the way you look at someone who carries a secret too heavy to be told. "Sometimes you have to leave to find yourself again," she said softly. I nodded without hesitation. Answer. For the first time in years, someone had said something that felt true. After dinner, I walked along the pier. The sea at night has a sound that does not console, but accompanies. The waves arrive rudely, as if they had learned to respect silence moments. I stopped near the railing, watching the lights of the harbor reflect on the water. I thought of my husband, of the way he held my hand when things went wrong. If he had still been alive, perhaps everything would have been different. But the truth was that I had let too many years go by waiting for someone to save me. Now I had to save myself. When I returned to my room, I found a message left under the door. It was the note from the notary. "We can meet tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. I read it 3 times, slowly. It was not just an appointment. It was the beginning of something. I turned off the light and stood staring at the ceiling. I could hear the sea in the distance, and a thought crossed my mind clearly. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want to stop being erased. The next day, I woke up early, dressed carefully, my blue sweater, and a wool scarf that still smelled like home. At the reception desk, I asked for a taxi. The notary had his office in the city center on a narrow street with antique shops and windows full of clocks. When I arrived, he greeted me with a respectful smile. "Mrs. Elena, it's nice to see you again," he said. I explained that I wanted to check the legal status of the house and see if it was still possible to change some things related to co-ownership. He looked for the file, opened it, and confirmed that I was still the owner of 50% of the property. "Everything is in order," he said. "If you want, you can also request an update of the deed." He nodded. "Yes, I want to." As I signed the papers, I felt a sensation I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not revenge, not resentment, but control. It was like getting my hands back on the helm of my life after a long drift. On my way back to the guest house, I stopped at a small bookstore. and bought a green-covered notebook. That evening, I began writing again. I wrote that I had a plan, even though I still didn't know how it would be accomplished. But I knew that I wouldn't go back. Not this time. My silence had become a choice, not a condemnation. And that suitcase I had packed in a hurry was now the symbol of something greater. The moment when a woman decides that dignity is not to be begged for, but earned. The next day, when I opened the windows of my room and the sea air came in to fill every corner, I understood that my escape had not been an impulse but a necessary gesture. Every breath brought with it a part of what I had left behind. The tiredness, the fear, the constant feeling of being a burden. I sat on the bed and thought about the key I had left on the bed table at home next to the note. It wasn't just an object. It was a symbol. The key was my last connection to that place I called home, but that hadn't been for a long time. I had calmly put it down, knowing that I would never pick it up again. That gesture contained my entire determination, not to return, not to explain, not to justify myself anymore. The notary had told me that the update to the property deed would be ready within a few short days. I could do everything remotely with digital signatures and modern procedures. It almost seemed ironic to me. I had spent my life dealing with tangible things, cooking, washing, tidying up, and now my redemption came through a legal document, a signature that wouldn't dirty even a fingernail. I had always thought that strength lay in hands, in work, in sacrifice. But that morning I understood that sometimes strength lies in letting go, in leaving without slamming the door shut, in putting down a key and walking away silently. I spent the day walking along the harbor. The moored boats swayed gently as if breathe. I lingered to observe an old fisherman carefully mending his nets. He had large, salt-worn hands and a serene expression, as if nothing could hurt him anymore. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "All your life," he replied without looking up. "And have you never gotten tired of it?" I asked again. He smiled. "I got tired when I stopped choosing." Those words stuck with me. That's exactly what I had done. For years, I had stopped choosing, letting others decide who I was, where I belonged, what I deserved. When I returned to retirement, I found a letter at the reception desk. It wasn't from the notary, but from my son. I recognized it immediately from the handwriting. Neat, precise, slightly tilted to the right. I didn't open it right away. I took it to my room, put it on the nightstand, and looked at it for a while as you look at an object that could explode at any moment. Then, slowly I opened it. Inside were a few lines. "Mom, where are you? We came home and didn't find you. Julia is worried. The children are asking for you. Please call me." No apology, no admission, just a request to be contacted. I read it several times, looking for a tone, an emotion, something that would make me believe it was genuine. But there was nothing. It was the message of a man who had lost control of his routine, not a son who had lost his mother. I folded it and put it in the green notebook. I didn't want to answer any more questions that came only when the silence of others became uncomfortable. The next evening, I went down to the common room of the boarding house. There were a few guests, almost all elderly like me. One of them, a man with a kind face, offered me a cup of tea. His name was Sergio. He was a retired teacher who had lived there permanently for years. "You quickly get used to the quiet," he told me, "but it takes courage to seek it out." We talked for a long time, and for the first time I felt listened to without having to justify my existence. I told him, without too many details, that I had left a home where I no longer felt welcome. He nodded, as if he knew that feeling. "Leaving is not running away," he said. "It's stopping to die slowly." Those words stuck to me like a warm cloak. In the following days, I began to build a new routine. In the mornings, I would take long walks. Then I would sit at the bar in the square to write. Every day a page of the green notebook would be filled. I didn't write to remember, but to remember myself. I described leaving a house that provided no space for my quietude, noting that I had at last found a haven, a place where I could finally breathe freely. I also wrote about the key, the one I had left on the table. I understood it to be a symbolic testament, a clear indication that one cannot confine a person who has chosen to relinquish their service. One afternoon, while I was drinking coffee and looking at the sea, I received a phone call from the notary. "Mrs. Elena," said the voice on the other end, "the deed has been updated. The entire share of the property is now registered in your name. A signed document from his son officially states his renunciation of his co-ownership rights. It writes." I was silent for a few seconds. "Did he renounce?" I asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "He said it was right." I thanked him, but deep down I knew that he hadn't done it out of a sense of justice. He had done it because something had scared him. Perhaps my disappearance, perhaps the realization that things were no longer under her control, didn't matter. The important thing was that, for the first time, the house was mine alone, and not out of revenge, but out of closure. That evening, when I returned to my room, I opened the window and let in the smell of the sea. I thought about the key on the table. They had probably found it with a note. Perhaps they had kept it, or perhaps they had thrown it away. Regardless of which situation, it was ultimately insignificant because the real key, the one I had discovered within myself, opened the door to a new life. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat for hours, watching the lights of the port go out one by one. I thought back to how, up until a few weeks earlier, I had lived for the benefit of others. Every day was a list of small gestures. Ironing shirts, fixing shoes, checking that dinner was ready. No one had ever asked me how I was, and I had stopped asking myself. Now, however, every gesture was mine alone. I no longer cooked to wait for someone. I no longer filled spaces that didn't belong to me. In the following days, 2 more letters arrived from my son. The first more urgent, the second colder. In the second he said, "If this is what you want, fine, but remember that we are your family." Those words made me smile bitterly. Families are not remembered, they are lived. They are not written only when the comfort you brought is missing. I didn't answer. I had learned that silence can say more than 1,000 explanations. When the sky cleared again after a week of rain, I decided it was time for another change. I went to look for a small apartment to rent near the sea, but further from the center. The owner was a widow like me, kind, with trembling hands but lively eyes. "It's small," she said, "but it's peaceful." I went in, and it took me a minute to understand that it would be mine. A large window, a simple kitchen, a smell of wood and saltiness. We signed the contract that same day. When I went back to the guest house to get my suitcase, the room suddenly seemed cramped, as if it had nothing more to offer me. I gathered my things, closed the door, and left the key at the front desk. "Go away?" the landlady asked me. "Yes," I replied, "but this time to stay." Upon leaving, a profound realization dawned on me. I was free from fear, free from apprehension about the future, free from the dread of solitude. I had made my choice, determined my path, and there was no room left for self-recrimination or regret. As I walked towards my new residence, the weight of my suitcase gradually diminished. It hadn't changed, but I had. Each step was a concrete manifestation of the freedom I was regaining. Arriving at my new home, I opened the door, allowing the refreshing sea air to enter without hesitation. This space was now mine. It was my home, my life. The key left on the table in my old home was utterly irrelevant. Almost 2 weeks had gone by since I had walked out of that house, leaving behind a life that had felt suffocating and unsatisfying. My new life, if it could be aptly described, had settled into a quiet but solid foundation. Each morning, I opened the window of my small apartment, letting the sunlit sea air flood in, and peacefully enjoyed my breakfast. The coffee tasted different, richer, perhaps because I was making it solely for myself, without the need to cater to another person's preferences. However, even amidst this burgeoning sense of serenity and contentment, a persistent part of me couldn't help but wonder about the events unfolding within the confines of my former home. For years, I had cared for her like a mother caring for a sick child. It wasn't an unhealthy curiosity. It was a deep-seated need to bring closure, a necessary step because you can't truly begin a new life as long as the past remains open and unhealed like an unstitched wound. One afternoon, while I was walking along the seafront, the phone at the guest house where I had previously stayed rang. It was the owner. Mrs. Elena said in a hesitant voice, "A letter has arrived for you. It's from your son." I asked her to open it and read it to me. Her voice trembled as she said the words, "Mom, Mom, I don't understand what you've done." When we returned, the house wasn't the same anymore. "You've changed everything. Where did your name end up on the documents? Why did you leave us like that?" I remained silent, listening until the last word. Then I thanked her and ended the call, and at that moment, I understood that they had returned, but not only in a physical sense they had returned to reality, the one from which they had always protected themselves with presumption. Look at the presumption. They had finally discovered that nothing was the same as before. I sat on a bench and watched the waves. People often talk about divine justice, but I believe that sometimes justice simply arrives when you stop covering up injustices with your silence. I had left the key, but I had also left traces of myself that could not be erased. Documents, signatures, legal documents. Every detail had been taken care of calmly before leaving. When I had updated the deed with the notary, I knew that it would not be long before they would realize it. That house was no longer just theirs. It was mine, completely. And they, in their selfishness, had not even realized how fragile the ground on which they walked was. I had not foreseen the exact moment when the truth would hit them, but I imagined the scene. I saw them returning home at night, after their celebratory dinner, with laughter mixed with wine and the arrogance of those who believe that life is an eternal banquet. Julia, with her expensive perfume and confident step, would have opened the door with her usual nonchalance. The children would have run in, screaming, and then silence, a different silence. An empty house has a sound that you don't forget. The walls seem to breathe differently. The objects seem to watch you. I vividly pictured their expressions as they walked in. The table impeccably clean, the note bearing my 3 words neatly placed beside the key, the light switched off, leaving my room completely empty, its curtains drawn shut. Perhaps Julia would have tried to play it cool, saying she must have wanted to scare us. But deep down, I knew something would have cracked. My son, on the other hand, would have sat down, stared into space, and understood why a son knows when a mother will not return. He feels it, not in his heart, but in his stomach, in that knot that no logic can untie. Then the real blow would come. I would have left the documents in a drawer, in plain sight, with the new name on it. The house was officially mine. They were, in fact, guests without rights. I vividly imagined the moment my son would discover the papers, carefully read them, his eyes widening in disbelief, and subsequently direct a searching accusatory gaze towards Julia. She would have shrugged her shoulders, denying any knowledge of the matter, but beneath the surface they would both experience the same emotion, fear. The fear of having lost control, the fear of having underestimated that silent woman they had thought was fragile. I wasn't there to see it, but I felt it as if I had her before my eyes. My absence had affected them more than any words, because there is no revenge more powerful than an absence that cannot be explained. With them struggling to comprehend the events, I found myself settled in my new home, a warm cup of tea, held gently in my hands, the soft sounds of the waves lapping the shore. The flavor of every sip suggested something final, devoid of joy or triumph, leaving only peace. And yet, despite everything, a part of me would have liked to be there, not to see them suffer, but to observe the moment when the truth would settle on their faces like dust, to see my son understand that every gesture has a weight, that every lack of love is paid for. But I didn't go. I had promised myself never to return to where I had cried, and I kept my promise. The night I received the news of their discovery, I couldn't sleep. Not out of anxiety, but out of reflection. I lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how little it takes to change the fate of a life. A message, a gesture, a door closed softly. I had lived more than 50 years trying to be a good mother, a good mother-in-law, a discreet presence, and yet, only by leaving had I learned to be myself. Perhaps the truth is that you never stop being a mother, but sometimes you have to learn to be one from a distance when love is no longer recognized. In the following days, Sepiglio had tried to contact me in every way. He had called the guest house, he had written emails, he had even asked a mutual friend to find out where I was. But I didn't answer. I had decided that my answer would be my silent saloon. Because certain lessons are not taught with words, but with consequences. And now the consequences were all there in front of me, him. A house without its mother. A void that no promotion, no applause could ever hope to fill. Oculo. One evening while I was walking on the deserted beach, I picked up a shell and held it in my hand. It was cold, but beautiful. I took it home and placed it on the nightstand. I called it the beginning, because yes, that really was a beginning. Not a new chapter, but a whole life rewritten slowly, with patience, with respect for myself. My son and Julia, on the other hand, were discovering what it meant to lose someone without a funeral, without goodbye, without explanations. They were learning that love is not infinite if you take it for granted, and that sometimes the person you think depends on you is the one who will one day pull the ground out from under your feet. That night, as the lights of the port went out one by one, I laid down on the bed and thought about the key I had left on the table. I imagined my son holding it in his hand, clutching it, perhaps crying silently, without really understanding how we had gotten there. I felt no joy, only a profound calm, like the sea after a storm. I had stopped waiting for someone to open a door for me. Now I knew how to build my own. The next morning I woke up before the sun. The sea, outside my window, was the color of steel, and the waves seemed to whisper more than they crashed. I got up slowly, like someone still carrying the weight of a long night, and made coffee. As I waited for the mocha pot to burble, I thought about how much silence there was in my life, and how that silence, which once hurt me, was becoming my greatest strength. It was as though the whole world had finally and completely stopped to allow me to breathe. And yet, right within that calm, I felt that something was changing not outside, but inside me. The silence was no longer just peace. It was becoming an echo, a message that traveled far towards them. Sitting at the table, I looked at the steaming cup of coffee and thought back to the days gone by. I knew that my son would not stop like that. He had always been proud, used to feeling like the center of history, to believing that everything revolved around him. The very notion that his mother could live without his approval was unacceptable to him. Therefore, when he discovered that the house was no longer his property and that each and every document bore only my name, something essential within him must have fractured. I imagined the look in his eyes as he stared at the papers, the anger rising from his chest, the need for explanations, but I wouldn't give him any, because silence, when deserved, weighs more than any truth. 3 days passed without news. 3 days during which my life followed a slow, almost ritualistic rhythm. In the morning I would go for a walk along the seafront, then I would buy a newspaper that I often didn't read, and in the afternoon I would write in my green notebook. Each page was a small part of my past self and a glimpse into the person I was becoming. I wrote about how you learn to be alone, about how the clatter of dishes in a distant restaurant can remind you that solitude is not emptiness, but space. Despite appearances, deep down I knew that silence wouldn't last forever. When you stop serving others, sooner or later, they will come knocking. And in fact, one evening the first one arrived, a call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice, as soon as I answered, pierced me like a splinter. "Mom, we need to talk." It was him. I stood still with the phone in my hand, listening only to the sound of his breathing on the other end of the line. "I don't know what's gotten into you," he said in a tired voice, "but you can't leave us like this. You put everything in your name. You took it all away with you. Do you realize that the house isn't ours anymore?" The word "our" almost made me smile. For years, I had lived in that house without feeling like it was mine. And now that it really was, he spoke of sharing. "You speak as if I had stolen something from you," I said. "Finally, calm down, calm down. I only took what was already mine." There was a long, heavy silence. Then he sighed, like a child caught in a lie. "We didn't mean you any harm," he whispered. "We just wanted a little space." Space. That word was the same one he had used when they had told me there was no room for me at the celebratory dinner. The space they had claimed was the one I had vacated, but now that they really had it, it seemed to suffocate them. "Now you have space, my son," I replied softly. "Make it enough." I hung up without waiting for an answer, not with anger, but with a stillness so profound that it almost frightened me. The following hours were filled with silence, but not an empty silence. It was as if every object in the room, every piece of furniture, every cup thanked me for that decision. I finally stopped explaining. I had reached the point of saying no mother should ever have to justify her inherent dignity. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under the door. It was handwritten, hurriedly, in nervous strokes. He said, "Mom, please, can we talk about this? Julia is upset. The children don't understand. Please don't be like this." Those words could have broken me once, but now they were no longer stabs. They were just echoes of a guilt that didn't belong to me. I folded them carefully and put them back in the pages of my green notebook, like you do with an old document that you keep not for affection, but for memory. More days passed. He didn't look for me anymore. Then, suddenly, the rumors began. In a small town, rumors travel faster than the wind. You heard from a neighbor that Mrs. Elena had left the family and that her son wasn't doing so well after the house thing that done thing. I wasn't surprised. People like to simplify what they don't understand. To them, I had become a figure to be pitied or judged, but it didn't matter. I knew the truth, and the truth doesn't need spectators. It was during those days that I received a visit from the postman. "There's a registered letter for you, Mrs. Ferry," he said, handing it to me. A white envelope. It was addressed to my son, but sent to my address. Perhaps he hadn't updated his residence. I opened it, and the contents made my blood run cold. It was a notification from the bank. Mortgage default, interest rates and arrears still bears. Procedure underway. I understood immediately what was happening. When I had taken over the entire property, I had also inherited its responsibilities, but the house was now free. I had already paid off every debt with the savings I had set aside over time just for that day. And that notification, instead of frightening me, gave me a strange certainty. My move had been better than I thought. If I hadn't acted in time, that house would have been lost to everyone. The next evening, I received a short, almost cutting message. "You ruined everything." There was no signature, but I knew who it was. I read it only once. Then I deleted it, not out of indifference, but by choice, because that sentence said more than he wanted to admit. I hadn't ruined anything. I had just stopped being the glue that held together what didn't deserve to stay together. The next day, as I was leaving the house, I saw a group of seagulls fighting over a piece of bread on the beach. One of them, smaller, moved away and found a whole shell by itself. I looked at it and thought about myself. Sometimes moving away from what everyone wants is the only way to find what you really need. So I started writing letters. Not to them, but to myself. Every evening, a letter that began with "Dear Elena," as if I were talking to myself in the mirror. In one of them, I wrote, "The silence that surrounds you is not empty. It is the echo of the freedom you have regained." I kept them in a drawer without ever rereading them. One night, however, I woke up with a start. I had dreamed of my old house. There was no more laughter or lights, only wide open windows and curtains moving in the wind. It was a dream, but it had the flavor of an omen. The next morning, I received a call from my lawyer. Mrs. Ferry said, in a serious voice, "I have received an unusual request. Her son is trying to challenge the change in the deed. He says she was manipulated." I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. "Don't worry," I replied. "Not for justice. She does it out of fear." That day I understood that my story wasn't over. The silence had spoken, and now the consequences were beginning, but I wasn't afraid anymore, because when a mother finds her voice, even silence becomes her most powerful Weapon I akumakimanin simfakalikin. And as the sun set behind the sea, I picked up my pen and wrote the last sentence of the day. The sound that has impacted my life the most was the moment when I gave up asking to be heard. The early hours of that morning were strangely calm, as if the world had held its breath waiting for something. The sky was a clear blue, and the waves moved with a deliberate slowness, as though they sensed the day was destined to bring a significant revelation. I woke up with a lump in my throat, a premonition that I couldn't explain. I made coffee, but I let it cool on the windowsill without drinking it. I sat down with the green notebook open in front of me, and for the first time I couldn't find the words. It was as if something was about to happen, something that would close one chapter and open another. I wasn't wrong. Shortly after 9 a.m., the phone rang. It was my lawyer. He stated, his voice tense, "Mrs. Ferry, an urgent notification has arrived. Your son has formally challenged the deed transferring the house. He's requested its annulment, arguing that you lacked the mental capacity to consent to the signature." I remained motionless, unable to speak. I grasped the table's edge, seeking some grounding in reality. After a brief moment, my sole reply was, "Did he truly say that?" "Yes," he replied, and attached a written statement from his wife. "They say she suffers from episodes of confusion and that she signed under pressure." I closed my eyes. It wasn't rage that consumed me, but almost unbearable pain similar to the feeling of suffocating while you're smiling. After everything I had done for them, after giving everything without asking for anything in return, now they were trying to paint me as a fragile, incapable, confused woman. "Don't worry," the lawyer added. "I have already prepared the legal response, but perhaps we should talk in person." I agreed. I needed to look into the eyes of that reality that until that moment I had only imagined from afar. I dressed calmly, as one does when going to a funeral, not of the body, but of trust. I put on my gray coat and the blue scarf that my husband had given me years before. As I walked to the lawyer's office, the city seemed different to me. Smaller, colder. Every step was a reminder of everything I had lost, and how little the words family and gratitude were worth when they became bargaining chips. A lawyer, a middle-aged man with a steady, kind gaze, greeted me with respect. "I know it's hard," he said, "but don't be afraid. The papers are in order, everything is legal. However, their move is clear. They want to frighten you, make you doubt him." I answered him softly. "I'm not afraid of losing anymore. I've already lost everything." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we will win not out of anger, but out of dignity." As I signed the response papers, I felt my hands tremble, not from fragility, but from strength held back too long. It was as if each signature were a small liberation, a claim to existence. When we finished, he handed me a copy and said, "From this moment on, Mrs. Ferry, they can't touch you anymore, they can't. Now the truth will be official." As I left the office, the wind hit my face hard, Owaganda. It was a salty, harsh wind, but it did me good. I walked towards the sea and sat down on a bench. I thought about my son. I tried to remember the last time he had really looked at me not as an obstacle, but as a mother. I couldn't. My memory brought back only fragments of commands, of gentle orders, of hasty glances, or perhaps, I thought, he had never really seen me. Then came the second call, none from my lawyer, but from a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. "Mrs. Elena, it's Marco, your son's neighbor, your son's—" My heart sank. "Good morning, Marco," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mo, what's going on?" There was a moment's hesitation. Then he sighed. "I don't want to interfere, but I think you should know. For a few days now, people have been coming and going from that house. Police officers, I think. They talk about seizures, suspended documents, and, well, I saw your son arguing with his wife in front of the gate. They didn't seem to be on good terms." I remained silent. All I could hear was the sound of the sea and the quickening of my heartbeat. "Thank you, Marco," I said, finally. "You did well to tell me." I ended the call, and stood there, motionless, watching the sea ripple. The echo of my silence was coming back to me like a boomerang. They had tried to destroy me out of pride, but now it was they who were sinking into chaos. And not because I had punished them, but because they had built their lives on a foundation of lies and convenience. In the following days, the news became clearer. The bank had opened an internal investigation. It turned out that my son had tried to apply for a new loan using the house as collateral, even though he knew it was no longer his. That was a serious crime. My lawyer called me. Now they don't have to fear her anymore. They have to fear themselves. I simply answered, I don't want to ruin them. I just want them to stop thinking that everything is owed to them. And yet inside, I couldn't feel satisfaction, only a deep emptiness like after a storm, because even if I knew I had acted right, every mother carries a part of her son inside, even when he behaves like unknown. Every wound that opens on him, even deserved, bleeds inside you too. One evening, when I returned home, I found a letter slipped under the door. There was no return address, but I already knew who it was from. Inside was a single sentence, written in uncertain handwriting. You have won, but you have lost a son. I read it 3 times, then took a pen, and on the back of the same sheet I wrote, No, I have lost an illusion, and I have found myself again. I have found myself again. I folded the letter and put it between the pages of the green notebook. From that day on, no more messages or calls arrived. Their voices faded, swallowed up by the silence they had so desired. And yet, that silence was different now. It wasn't my punishment. It was their fear. Fear of looking in the mirror and seeing what they had become. Every now and then, walking along the beach, I thought about her. A life manages to overturn everything without making a sound, always finds a way to emerge. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I had simply stopped allowing myself to be erased. I had chosen my dignity over their approval, and that silent but irrevocable choice had changed everything. I looked at the sea once more, and it seemed to me that it was looking back at me calmly, steadfastly, honestly. It was the first time I felt whole. The fear that had once paralyzed me was now theirs, and the shame that belonged to me had dissolved in the salt of the air. I had stopped being ashamed of being alone, and that, I understood, it was the first step towards true freedom. It was a March afternoon, one of those that bring a cold wind but a clear, limpid sun, as if winter had decided to make itself forgiven. My life had now passed slowly, almost in silence. Every day seemed like the same page, but reassuring. Coffee at 8, a walk along the seafront, writing in my green notebook why I lived with little and needed little. I had learned to breathe without having to ask permission, to smile for no reason, and to sleep without waiting for the sound of footsteps on the floor. I thought that everything was now stable, resolved like a chapter calmly closed, but that calm, that fragile quiet, was about to be shaken by something I had not foreseen, the return. I was folding some freshly dried laundry when I heard a knock at the door. It was not a loud knock, but a hesitant one, like the knock of someone who does not know whether to be welcomed or rejected. I thought it was the landlady or a neighbor, but when I opened it, I found myself in front of a figure that almost made me forget to breathe. It was him, my son, standing, with hunched shoulders, unkempt beard, red eyes. He had lost the confident tone I remembered, and the jacket he was wearing seemed too big for his body. For a moment he didn't speak. We stood there, motionless, the wind passing between us like an invisible barrier. Then he said softly, "Mom." That word, so simple and so familiar, pierced me. I hadn't heard it spoken in weeks, and yet it seemed foreign to me, as if spoken by a stranger. "What are you doing here, Marco?" I asked in a calm, almost neutral voice. He lowered his gaze. "I didn't know where else to go," he replied. "I don't want to come in. Just talk." I hesitated, then stepped back and opened the door. "Come in," I said. "Talking in the cold is useless." He entered, slowly, like a guest, not like a son. He looked around my house with a look I couldn't read. Perhaps surprise, perhaps shame. I didn't think you lived here, he said, almost to himself. It's small but clean. That's all I need, I replied. He sat down at the table, his hands clasped together, his gaze downcast. I don't know where to begin, he murmured. Dalvero, I replied. That's always a good place to start. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Fear, not of me, but of himself. You're right, he said. We did everything wrong. Julia, all of us, treated you like a burden. We didn't realize how much we were wearing you down, day after day. And when you left, I thought it was just a whim, a reaction. But then I saw the silence you left, and I understood that you were never coming back. I remained silent. I had waited for years to hear those words, and yet when they finally came, there was no triumph, only a calm sadness, almost sweet, like a light rain falling on a land now barren. And Julia? I asked. Marco sighed. She's gone. He says he couldn't stand the tension anymore, the debts, the house that was no longer home. He took the children away. He lives with his mother. He bowed his head in his hands. I lost everything, Mom, everything. Those last words, as harsh as they were, didn't surprise me. They were the logical consequence of everything they had sown. I looked at him for a long time, trying to recognize the child I had raised, the one who once ran towards me with his pants stained with dirt and his smile full of life. I couldn't find him. There was only a tired man, broken by his own choices. You haven't lost everything, I said finally. You've lost what you thought was rightfully yours. But life isn't an inheritance. It's something you build and respect. He raised his teary eyes. I'm not looking for excuses, Mom. I just want to know if you can forgive me. Those words, though sincere, fell on me like a weight. Forgiveness, I thought, isn't a coin to be handed out when your conscience hurts. It's a seed that only grows in the right soil, and my soil was still too dry for it to sprout. I don't know, I said slowly. I don't know if I can forgive, and I don't know if I should, but I can listen. He nodded and began to tell me everything. The pressure at work, the need to appear perfect, the fear of disappointing everyone. He told me that accepting the promotion wasn't driven by pride, but by a desperate need to finally feel worthy of my approval. He confessed that in his pursuit of this image of success, he had ultimately destroyed his home, his family, and himself. Julia wanted to appear, he said bitterly. I followed her. We thought that all we had to do was work, earn money, host dinners, and smile in front of everyone. But inside the house, there was a chill, and you were the only fire left. We put you out so we wouldn't feel guilty. Those words hurt me like a slow blade. And yet, as I listened to him, I understood that my revenge, if you could call it that, was complete. Not because I had punished them, but because I was finally seeing my son for who he was, a man who had learned to look after himself. And that vision, more than any loss, was worth everything. We sat for a long time, in silence. Then he offered him some tea, which he drank slowly with shaking hands. When he finished, he put the cup down and said, I know I don't deserve anything, but I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to fix what's left. I smiled slightly at him. You don't have to fix anything, Marco. Sometimes you just have to accept that some dishes don't stick together anymore. He nodded, his eyes full of tears that he was trying to hold back. Can I come back and see you? He asked. Not to stay, just to know that you're okay. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, you can try, but remember, only come in if you really knock, not out of habit. He stood up, and before leaving, he looked at me as if he wanted to imprint that scene in my memory. Have you changed? He whispered. No, I replied. I'm back to being who I was before you forgot me. When he closed the door behind him, I stood still for a few minutes. The air smelled of you and memories. I felt no anger or pity, only a new calm, the kind that comes when the justice of the heart finds balance. I didn't need to say I'm sorry, because life had already said it for him, Mom. I had obtained what I had always sought, not revenge, but recognition. Later, as the sun was setting, I wrote in my notebook, cuckoo, Today I saw my son not as a tormentor, but as a man who had lost his way, and for the first time I didn't want to save him. Those words gave me peace. It was truly over, not the war, but the emotional dependence. I no longer needed them to ask me for forgiveness. It was enough to know that when they remembered that house and that closed door, they would hear the echo of everything they had lost, not through guilt, but by choice. That night, I slept without dreams. The sea outside continued to breathe softly as if it were rocking me to sleep. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because by now I knew forgiveness isn't granted, it's earned. And I had finally conquered my silence. The following days passed like a slow echo. After that visit, the house seemed fuller, but not with noise, but with awareness. Every corner still held the scent of the tea we had drunk together, the sound of his broken voice, the pauses between one word and the next, those silences that said more than 1,000 sentences, muerto. I didn't feel relieved but lighter, as if that conversation had finally laid to rest a burden that I had been carrying for years without realizing it. Marco had come to me not to complain, but to confess. And his repentance, even if it wasn't enough to erase the pain, hadn't cracked the wall of pride that had separated them from me. However, I knew that the truth once revealed never stops working. It seeps in, spreads, and slowly causes everything that had been built on lies to crumble. In the days that followed, fragments of news started to reach me just as waves bring to shore objects long forgotten by the sea. The upstairs neighbor told me that Julia had returned to the city, that she was living in a small apartment with her children, and that she often cried in public, trying to justify her version of events. She told everyone that her mother-in-law had ruined her, that she had taken her house away from her, that she had manipulated Marco. But after a while, people stopped believing tragedy told with too much theatricality. They began to see her for what she had always been, a woman more concerned with appearances than the truth. Marco, on the other hand, had stopped responding to gossip. He found out from a mutual friend who told me that he had seen him sitting alone in a bar without a phone, his gaze lost in space at ease. With the air of someone who understood too late, the man said to me in a kind tone. Those words struck me more than I wanted to admit. I felt no pity, but a bitter tenderness, because yes, that was exactly what he was. It's far too late for the apologies, the missed dinners, the hugs that were delayed. Every evening when I got home, I wrote not letters to him, but reflections for myself. I wrote that when conscience finally awakens, it doesn't knock softly. It devastates. It forces you to look inside yourself, to see your mistakes, to recognize the shadows you've created. And Marco, at that moment, was experiencing his awakening. I didn't have to do anything. No punishments or words were needed. Conscience is the most precise sentence there is. One afternoon, I received a short message from an unknown number. I don't ask for forgiveness, but thank you for not responding with hatred. It was unsigned, yet no signature was needed. I deleted it without responding, not out of coldness, but out of respect. Certain conversations must be held in abeyance, much like bridges that are not yet ready to be crossed. During that period, my life continued with a simplicity that healed me. I became friends with the owner of the flower shop down the street. Her name was Teresa. Every morning, as she arranged the roses in front of the window, she would give me a smile and a few kind words. You look different, she said one day, like someone who has stopped defending herself. I didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. Maybe it's true, I said. When you're no longer afraid of being alone, you don't need to defend yourself anymore. One Saturday morning, as I was walking along the pier, I met Sergio again, the man from the guest house who had offered me tea weeks earlier. He was sitting on a bench with a book in his hands. Do you remember me? He asked. How could I forget? I answered, smiling. We talked for a long time, and at the end he told me something that has stayed with me. Sometimes life gives us back what it owes us, but not in the form we had imagined. I did not yet know, but those words would later turn out to be prophetic. A few more days passed. Then a call came that I hadn't expected. It was Marco again. His voice was calm, almost fragile. "Mom, can I see you?" I took a moment. "Why?" I asked. "Because I want to show you something," he replied. I accepted, more out of curiosity than hope. We met on the promenade, near the small lighthouse where I often went for walks. I saw him approaching slowly, but with a different, clearer expression. He showed me a folder. Inside were some documents. He explained, "Mota, I've sold my car, and as a result I've started a training course. My goal is to get back to my previous job, the one I genuinely loved before it all devolved into nothing more than a career in a superficial display." I said nothing. He continued, "I don't want to prove anything to you. I just want you to know that I'm trying to become a better man, not for you, but for my children." That sentence struck me like a sudden ray of light. Perhaps I would never have the child I had raised back, but at least the world would be better off with a father who was more aware, and that was all that mattered to me. We sat on the wall and looked out to sea. We didn't talk about the past, or home, or mistakes, just about life, choices, time. Then he said quietly, "You know, Julia called me. She says she wants to come back, but I said no. I understand that some people don't change. We change." I smiled. "Maybe you finally learned to choose," I said. He laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in years. When we said goodbye, we didn't hug. It wasn't necessary. True affection, after so much pain, doesn't need theatrical gestures. The proof lies in their eyes, in their slower, calmer breaths, in the shared understanding of having both braved and survived the same tempest. I went home and opened the green notebook. I wrote, "Forgiveness is not surrender, it's proof that pain no longer has power over you." Then I closed the notebook and looked out the window. The sky was clear, and in the reflection I saw my face. It was no longer that of a wounded mother, but of a woman who had learned to exist on her own. The following weeks passed peacefully. Marco would occasionally write me short messages without questions or apologies, just sharing. "I found a job. I miss the children. I am fine." And I answered with the same simplicity. We had not returned to being mother and son as before, but two human beings who finally respected each other. In the meantime, the word about us in the village had changed. No one spoke any more of the mother who ran away or of the family that was destroyed. Now they only said, "Mrs. Ferry, a strong woman." And this simple definition was enough for me. One evening, while Teresa was closing her flower shop, she gave me a white rose for peace. She said, I took it home, put it in a vase, and looked at it for minutes. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and I understood that that rose was the perfect image of my new life, fragile but alive. Sitting in front of the window, I wrote one last sentence in my notebook. When the conscience awakens, it does not destroy, it purifies. And as the pen glided over the last page, he felt the story coming to a close, not with vengeance, but with a profound peace, the kind that only those who have faced the truth and chosen to remain standing can understand. It was a Sunday morning, and the sea was as still as glass. The air smelled of bread and salt, and the streets were almost deserted. I woke up with a different feeling than usual. It wasn't joy or nostalgia. It wasn't even relief. It was something that resembled the end. Not in the somber, negative sense of the word, but rather like closing a book that moved you to tears, challenged you, and helped you to grow. And you know it's time to put it back on the shelf. I had lived through weeks full of emotional waves, but now I felt that everything was settling like dust that stops dancing in the air and slowly returns to the earth. I got myself a coffee, and while I drank it slowly, standing there, in my slippers with the golden sunlight coming in through the window, I understood that I had no more desire to look back. There was no more pain, no more anger, not even resentment, just a crystal clear awareness. I was no longer the one who had left the house in silence, and that house, in turn, was no longer mine. The news came to me in the early afternoon, unexpected and definitive. The owner of the flower shop, Teresa, stopped me with a surprised expression. "Have you heard?" she asked, in a low but tense voice. That house, has been put up for sale." I remained motionless. That house didn't need to say anything else. It knew, and I understood. Marco, without saying anything, had decided to let it go. He had finally understood that it was no longer a place to defend, but a shell that had been emptied for too long. A box filled only with absences. I didn't ask anything else. Upon returning home, I settled down by the window, watching the clouds drift slowly across the sky. I thought about that empty house now, without fake laughter, or hushed arguments without the smell of tomato sauce, or footsteps on the stairs, a house without photographs hanging, without blankets folded by loving hands, without the sound of a spoon in a cup, only walls, only echoes. And I wondered how many mothers had become invisible within those walls, how many sacrifices had been absorbed by that floor without ever being returned. That house was now waiting for a new beginning, but it was no longer my business. It almost seemed right that it should end like this, not with a sensational gesture, not with an act of revenge or a dramatic comeback, but with normality of things that unravel on their own when you stop supporting them. I had left the house with dignity, and now that house was fading away with the same silent composure. It was no longer my burden. It was no longer my problem. Marco didn't write to me. He didn't call me. No official announcement, no explanation, and I didn't need any. He had understood. That decision, made in silence, was worth more than any words. Perhaps for the first time, my son had acted thinking about what was right, not what was convenient. And in that choice, even if it was late, I saw redemption. Not for him, but for me. In the following days, something inside me began to change. I smiled without realizing it at the supermarket cashier. I called an old friend for a coffee. I took a book to the beach and stayed there until sunset with my bare feet in the sand. Small gestures, but each time I felt a piece falling into place. I had freed myself from the constraints of an imposed role, a family that had abandoned me, and a son who had only ever known how to beg for things. My identity was finally I was just me, Elena, a woman, not a mother, not a mother-in-law, not a housekeeper, not paid, just a person who had suffered, but had not broken. One morning, while I was walking along the seafront, I stopped in front of the window of a shop that sold household items. There was a handwritten sign that said, "Your home is where you stop asking permission." I read that sentence at least 5 times. It seemed to me that it had been written for me. I went in and bought a small glass and iron lantern with a white candle inside. I went home, put it on the table, and lit it. For me, it was like planting a flag. That was my home, and there I could finally exist without having to justify myself. During that period, I began to write with greater intensity. Every single page of my green notebook served as a declaration of my existence. I wrote about my newfound dignity, the strength that is born after a collapse, the silent beauty of a woman who chooses peace over pride. When I had filled the last page, I calmly closed the notebook and tied it with a ribbon, not to file it away, but to honor it. It was the diary of my resurrection. One evening, while I was cooking for myself a simple but carefully prepared dish, I looked at myself in the kitchen mirror. My gray hair was tied back, my wrinkles were more pronounced, but my gaze was more alive than ever. I wasn't rejuvenated. I hadn't recovered what I had lost, but I had gained something more precious. My voice. Sometime later I received one last letter. It was from Marco. Inside there was just one sentence. I sold the house. I used the money to start from scratch, but know that not a day will go by without me thinking about what I did to you. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply closed the envelope and put it back in the drawer, next to the notebook. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't reconciliation. It was reality. That house was now just another place among many. An address for sale, an empty structure, Instead, I was full of experience, truth, freedom, treedom. And for the first time in years, my life was no longer a space to be filled by others, but a time to be inhabited by me. That night, I lit the lantern again, turned off the lights and sat in silence. I watched the flame flicker, delicate but alive, and I said to myself, this is peace, and it has finally found a place.